But actually, the internet has grown up in such a way and in such an unregulated way, and yet its influence is so powerful and so pervasive in so many areas that it has to be right that governments say, hang on a second, let's look at what's going on there. Let's look at, how should we regulate? If so, how do we regulate? Which bits of the internet do we think actually do need to be looked at in more detail? And people should be questioning, is this right?
Well, welcome to Political Sandbox by Chamber. My name is Robert Buckland, Conservative MP and former Cabinet Minister, and I'm joined today by my good friend and former Commons colleague, now known as the Baroness Morgan of Cotes, better known to you and me as Nicky Morgan. It's lovely to see you, Nicky.
Very nice to be here.
And it's a chance for us just to have a brief conversation about a subject I know you know a lot about, because your last job in Cabinet, among the many jobs you did in government, was of course as DCMS Secretary, Culture Secretary. And no doubt the online harms issue was very much in your in tray when you served as Secretary of State. Now we have a bill, it's been published, we've been through a draft procedure, we've seen how Parliament has scrutinised it. Cutting to the chase, where do you think we are with online harms at the moment?
Well, I think there is a pretty firm agreement in Westminster that this needs to be tackled. I think inevitably the bill is going to be scrutinised quite rightly. This is a big step. And actually, I'm very proud that the UK government is taking what is a world-leading step. No legislation, as you know, is ever going to be perfect. Yeah. And you also know from your career as a barrister that the courts will particularly, I think, pore over this one. And the tech companies are going to be asking for clarifications and everything else. But actually, the internet has grown up in such a way and in such an unregulated way, and yet its influence is so powerful and so pervasive in so many areas that it has to be right that governments say, hang on a second, let's look at what's going on there. Let's look at, should we regulate? If so, how do we regulate? Which bits of the internet do we think actually do need to be looked at in more detail? And people should be questioning, is this right? And other bits which actually facilitate, free speech, the ability of people to campaign, particularly against oppressive regimes, for example. Like every tool, the internet is brought many advantages. There are some issues. And I think the regulation is long overdue. But
I suppose that begs the question, what type of regulation? And what we're seeing in the bill, I mean, the critics are lining up and saying, hold on, this is a bill that actually cops out. It's leaving a lot of big decisions to secondary legislation. And I think, for people watching secondary legislation, that is, there's the statutory instrument approach, which has less scrutiny, less parliamentary time, can be nodded through. That could have quite an effect on freedom of speech and content in a way that perhaps hadn't been envisaged by the drafters of the bill. And then secondly, this concept of legal but harmful. How on earth do you define it? First of all, if it's illegal, why should we be intervening? And secondly, what do we mean by harm? Because harm means different things to different ages and vulnerabilities. I mean, do you think the government's got themselves into a bit of a tangle on this? Are they in the right place?
To be honest, I think whatever the government did, a government of any hue, actually, I think it would have found it difficult. It's a very challenging piece of legislation. And there's no doubt it's a bill that you need to read carefully with a wet towel wrapped around your head, and you need to read it several times. So I suppose what I would say, in terms of secondary legislation, I think one of the great challenges, of course, is that technology is moving on so quickly. So, if you legislate for something to, control an algorithm today, then it could be a completely different way of content being curated and monitored and handled in only, we could say 2 years' time. I mean, it's moving so quickly. So I think there has to be an element of you can't put everything on the face of the bill. I think one of the challenges for the bill is it becomes what's called a Christmas tree bill, where everybody hangs off their own, particular pet loves and hates, and then the whole bill falls over because it sort of collapses under its own weight. So that is definitely a danger, so that the government will be beating off, to a certain extent, some amendments, because I think they'll be saying, well, hang on a second, that's not right for this bill, we will do this, it's got to come. So I think, you're going to have other pieces of legislation, and I think this is probably only the first of the online safety bills, in the sense that, inevitably, because technology will change, because the platforms will change, the way people use them is going to change, this is going to be a step in the right direction. The other thing, of course, is not necessarily secondary legislation, but Ofcom, who are going to be the regulator. And I was the one that made the decision that Ofcom should take it on, and we can go into why that is. They're going to publish these codes of practice, what they expect from the tech platforms. That's another way, obviously. I mean, those will be scrutinised. They'll be laid before Parliament, but that's another way for the people to sort of say, well, hang on a second, how are we going to keep those up to date, and how are we going to have input into them? But I think there were lots of ways that looked at how to draft the bill, and I think this is probably it's never ideal, but it's the best one. And I certainly know in my end, the House of Lords, there'll be huge amounts of scrutiny of the secondary legislation route. And then legal but harmful. So I have some sympathy. I mean, I think obviously it's illegal content is defined, and one would think that terrorism content, child sexual abuse content, pretty clear. There is a definition of harm in the bill. And actually, I did some Googling recently, and there are plenty of court cases, as you might imagine, where harm and significant harm has been debated and looked at and judged and everything else. There is a philosophical debate about whether something that is legal but harmful, should be regulated. And no doubt there is a lighter regulatory regime for such content. But I do think we have to ask ourselves, why is it that we would allow to flourish unchecked misogynistic content, content that promotes violence against women and girls, content that is racist, content that incites people towards vience, for example.
That's clearly unlawful, isn't it? I mean, the question is, where do we draw the line?
Where do we draw the line? And I think that's why, so a lot of this comes back to the tech companies in the sense that Ofcom will draft, and and platforms often will say, so at the moment I'm chairing an inquiry into digital online fraud in the Lords. So it might well be, you might say, well, hang on a second, advertising, a particular type of financial investment is a legal thing to do. But actually, if you happen to know that actually this is not legitimate, or it's not a firm that is registered with our Financial Conduct Authority, then I think it does tip over into being something that is going to cause people harm, for example. And the platforms and search engines will say, we take very seriously our responsibility to check who's advertising, or to make sure that actually racist content is not allowed to flourish and everything else. But what they say and what's happening on the platforms can be two different things. And I think what this is about is saying, you say you've got these terms and conditions, you say that you enable people to complain, for example. Do you really? Does that really work? Do people feel that they're getting heard if they make a complaint, and they're getting a reason as to why content is or is not taken down, for example? And I just firmly believe that government should be setting these rules, not Silicon Valley.
Yeah, I think your point about online fraud, I mean, that is a growth area like
massive.
No other. There are victims proliferating all the time. And being frank, I don't think law enforcement's anywhere near being able to get to grips with. They don't have the capacity or the expertise, frankly, in the police force or the City of London Police. The action fraud line, of course, was a salutary lesson in how not to do it, frankly. And the Home Secretary has reformed it. But unless we get the industry to help design out fraud,
absolutely,
and design out some other abuses, then we're not going to get anywhere. And I mean, the question for me is, is this bill going to be enough of a stick, with a bit of carrot, obviously, to encourage that? And I think it begs the question, there's lots of other issues in the ether. We've got the Digital Markets Unit issue, which the government seems to be sort of backing off from a bit, which I think is a missed opportunity. They're going to have to really grasp the nettle on that, because clearly at the moment you've got this related issues about content and who pays for it and who actually benefits from it.
The data, who's harvesting the data.
Exactly. So all these things are linked, because it seems to me that a wholly unregulated space, whilst it allows enterprise and initiative and efficiency to flourish, it can also encourage the sort of harms that I think would be particularly problematic for people with vulnerabilities, elderly people being defrauded, or young people being groomed, or whatever it might be. So you're going to be, I think, taking part in the debates when it comes down to the Lords?
Yes, most definitely. And of course, the Lords end, everyone can take part in committee stage, so everyone can, and every amendment gets to be discussed and everything else, as I'm learning. So, I'm a very baby peer, but learning how the at that end works. And I think you raised some. I mean, there's some great points, and safety by design. So what you'll see already is that the tech platforms are already just beginning to think, well, hang on, if the UK is going to have the regulation and we're launching this new product or new this, that, and the other, how do we actually make sure that actually it's already going to be more likely to be compliant with the bill? And that's what we want to see. It's that nudge element. There'll be a debate about enforcement. At the moment, there are fines that could be levied.
Yes.
I personally think actually senior manager liability, I think having a named person, as you do in financial services, having somebody who's got that sort of potential liability also concentrates the mind, but that is another area for discussion.
Well, indeed, and the economic crime agenda is one that we could wax lyrical on with all your expertise and interest in financial services,
Absolutely.
but sadly time does not permit us. So we're going to have to draw stumps there. We're both cricket enthusiasts, so we're going to draw stumps today, but we'll renew the conversation, I'm sure,
Indeed.
very soon. It's lovely to see you, Nicky, and thanks for joining us.